Hello students! Today we're talking about Catholics and Protestants as we continue to talk about the Reformation that took place in Europe. Let's start by talking about the Counter-Reformation. And the Counter-Reformation was the Catholics' response to what Martin Luther had done and what John Calvin had done and how the Reformation had taken place. And remember, the Catholic Church was losing people and they wanted to find ways to get people to come back together. So they had what was called the Council of Trent. And this was held to determine what changes need to be made by the Catholic Church. And of course, the first thing they came up with was they got rid of the sale of indulgences. But they also decided that they needed to train new priests. So they created seminaries or schools that were set up to teach priests. They also created a new order of priests called the Society of Jesus. And these people were referred to as Jesuits, and Ignatius of Loyola is the one that founded this society, and he taught them how to teach, preach, and fight against heresy. So that's what the Catholic Church was trying to do to kind of counter what was going on with the Reformation. Now, of course, Catholics and Protestants led to religious wars, and there was one in France. And at the time, Protestants in France, they were called Huguenots. And it's important to remember that though there was many Catholics in France, there were also quite a few Protestants. French nobles wanted to weaken the king, and many of the Huguenots were nobles. So, there was a guy named Charles, and at age 10 he became king, but at age 10 you're too young to rule a country. So his mother, Catherine, actually ran the government. This leads to civil war, and Catherine has many of the Huguenots and Protestants executed, and eventually, after the war takes place, a guy by the name of Henry of Navarre becomes king. And he does this thing where he becomes a Catholic. So he was a Protestant, but he becomes a Catholic in order to get the people of France to support him. But then he issues the Edict of Nantes. An Edict of Nantes allowed Protestants to worship freely in France. Now, another war that took place was called the 30 Years' War. And this was fought in the Holy Roman Empire in the 1600s. And the Holy Roman Empire, if you remember, was made up of mostly Germany and some of the surrounding area. It began in Bohemia when the Bohemians rebelled against the Catholic king. It became a war of kingdoms because France, Sweden, Denmark, England, and even the Netherlands all joined on one side, and that was the Protestant side. And then you had Spain and the Holy Roman Empire that were on the Catholic side. Now, this war was fought, and eventually it was won, and the Protestants won. And the result was this weakened Spain, but it made France a very powerful country. So the balance of power in Europe was changing because of this 30 Years' War. So now let's talk about Spain, as Spain became weaker. And we've talked about Spain before. We talked about Ferdinand and Isabella and how they united Spain and everything. But the Reformation in Spain was different than anywhere else. Spain wanted all of their subjects to be Catholic. And so we talked about how in 1492 they expelled all the Jews, they expelled all the Muslims. They told them you had to either convert or leave the country or you would be killed. And then we've also talked about the Spanish Inquisition and how the Spanish Inquisition was there to go investigate people's beliefs and actually find people that were not Catholic, and then they tortured these people, and many people died, and it was just a brutal thing in Spain. Now there's one more Reformation I'd like to talk about, and that is the English Reformation. And the English Reformation was different than any other Reformations because it wasn't as much about religion as it was about King Henry and wanting to have a son. Now, Henry VIII, probably one of the most famous kings in English history, starts his own church when the Pope would not annul his marriage. Now, you see, Henry wanted to have a son. He'd already had a daughter, but he wanted to have a son. And his wife at the time was not able to give him a son. So, when the Pope would not divorce him or annul his marriage, he went and started his own church. Henry also had 2 daughters and 1 son. His second marriage, he had another daughter, so he had her executed, his wife, and then his third wife finally gave him a son. Right? His son, though, was a sickly child. He was a weak person, and he didn't last very long. And so even though he didn't want it, eventually Henry's daughter Mary takes over the throne. And Mary, being upset about her father and being a Protestant and everything, Mary was a Catholic. Mary goes back to the Catholic ways. She has many Protestants killed, so many in fact she becomes known as Bloody Mary. Now Mary's reign wasn't very long, and after she dies, her sister Elizabeth was a Protestant, and she restored the Anglican Church. So she's the one that kind of came back to changing the Catholic Church back into a Protestant church. So let's talk about Calvinism and his effects on England. We talked about Calvin before, but in England, because of Calvin, people demanded the Anglican Church give up its Catholic ways. These people became known as Puritans because they wanted to purify or get rid of anything that had to do with Catholic in their church. Both King James and King Charles persecuted the Puritans, and eventually many moved to America to practice their religion freely, which were the Pilgrims that first came over and established colonies in the Americas. That's our little talk about Catholics and Protestants and what was going on in Europe. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in class.